Welcome to Maxability. To unfold different layers of knowledge, stay tuned with us till the end of the video.
Thank you guys for joining the webinar, Deconstructing UX for Accessibility. Um, as you know, user experience plays a vital role in any product design or web design. And if we take accessibility as priority or as an important task at the time of user experience designs, it will fit right there, and it will be easy for the rest of the teams to use the experiences while building the entire product. So that's the reason we have taken UX as this particular session, as Jack have suggested, to share information about the UX and the role of accessibility in user experience. Thank you, Jack, for that topic, and hope people will be benefited out of the session. And uh, yeah, Jack have a wide experience in accessibility. He's currently the product manager for Creative Cloud Accessibility at Adobe, and he has been uh, at Starbucks before and has a wide portfolio where he has been a developer and have a few of other roles. We'll hear from him before we get started. Um, so the final point I want to make sure that people have is be on mute throughout the session and drop your messages on chatbot if you have anything to share or if you want to say anything. Be, don't be don't unmute yourself, and there will be a Q&A at the end of the session. If you can hold on your questions until then, it will be helpful for running the session as Jack would have planned. Thank you. With that, I am sharing out to Jack. Jack, you can mute all, and maybe you can unmute only yourself. I'll mute myself, and probably that will be. Previously, I used to mute everyone and let the presenter unmute himself, but now I could not see that option to unmute everyone. So all of you be please muted from your side. And with that, handing over to Jack. Thank you.
Let's see here. I am not quite as familiar with Zoom. Just trying to determine how to mute everyone else. So, to speaker. I'm sorry, Rakesh, I don't actually see a control.
I think now the voice is clear. We can go ahead and we can let the people mute themselves if someone do so.
Yeah, I think that might be the simplest thing. I don't seem to have the rights to be able to mute everyone else. So if you would please go ahead and mute the mics on your own computer, that would be helpful. Okay, so my name is Jack Nicolai. And as Rakesh said, I am the Accessibility Product Manager for the Creative Cloud portfolio at Adobe. I also represent most of our educational and communications software within our print and publishing business unit, our main website, adobe.com, and several of our other websites like the Adobe Help Center and Adobe Fonts. I'm happy to say that this month I'm celebrating my 3-year anniversary at Adobe as well. So I've been involved in the web and software industry for the last 19 years. I got my start working for an e-learning company where I got my first sort of taste and was exposed to creating accessible software. I spent several years before coming to Adobe working for Starbucks, leading product teams who developed Starbucks.com and their mobile applications for iOS and Android. Along the way, I've also worked as a product designer, an animator, an engineer, a trainer, an evangelist, among many other roles over the years. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm going to take just a moment to touch on the high-level agenda. Let's see here. So I'll be doing a brief introduction and preview some of the UI components I'll be discussing. I'll provide a description of progressive enhancement to root the approach I take in my experience as a web developer, and then in terms of sort of breaking down and analyzing an interface, and then dive into deconstructing some of the UI components themselves. So finally, I'll share a little bit about what we do at Adobe to document accessibility requirements within UI components, a method that we refer to as blue lines. So my goal is to help you to develop a sort of accessibility X-ray thinking. Similar to X-ray vision, accessibility X-ray thinking is a way of deconstructing a design or an interaction in order to uncover the attributes necessary to deliver an accessible experience. This talk is more than just talking about the code behind the design. It's also about inspecting the behaviors and expectations we should have from the components we encounter. So on this slide, we see an image of what looks like a profile image of an X-ray of a person's head, and where their brain should be, we see lots of gears, like sort of images of gears to convey this idea of being able to kind of see through and into people's thoughts, sort of this idea of sort of X-ray thinking. So while I'm going to provide some context up front, there may be terms or concepts you may not be as familiar with based upon your own experience. Please make a note and be sure to submit your questions for the Q&A at the end if I don't otherwise explain something clearly. So the information I'm sharing and opinions I'm expressing today are my own. You may well disagree with some of my views about how these components and user experiences should work. That is, in fact, a good thing. A healthy amount of skepticism is useful when analyzing a design. Personally, I'm more concerned with clarity of meaning and consistency of behavior than strict rules. The same solution in a different environment may prove to be completely inaccessible. So today, my goal is to provide you some methods and tools to determine your own answers. So what we're looking at is an image of sort of a cropped image of the Creative Cloud website, where as a Creative Cloud subscriber, when you log into adobe.com, you can visit creativecloud.adobe.com, and it takes you to a sort of personalized environment where you have access to your own Creative Cloud library files, information about the apps that are available as a Creative Cloud subscriber, as well as options if you want to download, install, update, that sort of thing, as well as access to learning information. So before I get a little technical, let's start by looking at a few live pages on adobe.com, which contain some of the components that I'll be talking about. So what we should see here is the web page I was just showing a cropped image of. And let's talk about a few of the things that we see here. So there are a handful of different components. We have a carousel in sort of the main content view. We have content cards, which are represented as each of the slides essentially within the carousel itself. We have variations of floating. So in the bottom right corner, we see an icon, and when I roll over it, I see a tooltip or label that says contact us that provides access to a customer service interface. And then let's see a little further, we flip over to the apps section. And actually I'm gonna, refresh this page real quick. And we see a list of the different desktop apps that are available through Creative Cloud, a list of content cards, and to the right, along the right side, we see some calls to action, which include a UI component, which is often referred to as a split action button or a split button. So we'll be talking about many of these components along the way. So I would like to take just a moment to gather some information from you, the audience. If you would, and I'm going to post this question directly in the chat. So if you'll open up your Zoom chat, I'd like to get some feedback from you about what components or user interactions do you find challenging to make accessible for those of you that are actually designing or developing. Right. So I'm going to give folks just a minute to contribute. I'd love to hear sort of as much as possible from folks. Great. So far we're seeing things like carousels, maps and charts, drag and drop, shuttle controls. Oh, I'm not sure. I'll be interested to find out a little bit more about what a shuttle control refers to. Chatbots, absolutely. And a lot of these different components provide the right when something changes, in particular with the chatbot. And I'm getting a couple of errors just saying that my internet connection is having some problems. But if folks need me to repeat anything, please go ahead and indicate that in the chat. So we see some additional feedback here about animated banners, text and images. Okay. I think maps and charts is a great example because often there's a lot of complex information that needs to be represented, and really what's the best way to do that, to basically provide the same information. Sometimes that means that it's reflected in a table, or it might be kind of a narrative description. So tagging and structure in InDesign, and I think that might be referring to, most work in InDesign. I think that might be referring a bit to PDF tagging, which is a little bit outside of the scope of this particular talk, but absolutely. And you can also, of course, export from InDesign to other formats like SVG, which of course, would have some similar accessibility requirements. Okay. Let's see here. So I've included in the deck definitions for both WAY ARIA 1.1 and the WAY ARIA authoring practices 1.1. I may be making references to WAY ARIA, or ARIA for short, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and the guidance provided by the ARIA authoring practices. It's helpful to understand a bit about them. The short version about ARIA is that it is a specification like HTML is. ARIA is composed of attributes added to HTML markup, which add or replace semantic meaning to HTML elements, and often work in combination to describe components and user interactions not supported by standard web components. So for a lot of the different UI components or interactions that folks were submitting in the poll, things like the chatbot in particular, to really create that chatbot experience in a way that is going to work for assistive technology users, screen reader users, ARIA actually is a necessary component of that. So here we have the definition for those that might not be able to see it for WAY ARIA. So the Accessible Rich Internet Application Suite, it defines a way to make web content and web applications more accessible to people with disabilities. It especially helps with dynamic content and user interface controls developed with AJAX, HTML, JavaScript, and related technologies. Let's also then just take a quick look at a definition, or at least a description, of the way ARIA authoring practices. It recommends approaches to help web application developers make widgets, navigation, and behaviors accessible using the way ARIA roles, states, and properties. So all the things that are described in the way ARIA spec are then put into practice, and there are descriptions within the authoring practices. I sort of think of them as UX design patterns. It might not be an actual one-to-one mapping, but I think it's an easy way when talking to designers about how the authoring practices documentation can help them to understand UI components, understand the behaviors that underpin them, and the properties, the states and properties that need to be managed for them. It's a great resource. So it describes considerations that might not be evident to most authors or designers for that matter, from the way ARIA specification, which is oriented primarily at user agent implementers. So, ARIA itself, the specification can be a little dry, and the authoring practices put the specification into practice. And so I think for any designer out there that is developing really not only just for the web, I think it's a useful place to go, whether you're designing for desktop or mobile, because it does a really a decent job of helping to create or describe all of the parts and pieces that are needed to explain a component or explain a user interaction from the perspective of things like keyboard interactions or keyboard access. So I definitely recommend folks checking those out. I've included a resource slide towards the two slides at the end of the deck that will be available that link directly to these, or you can simply do a Google search for them. Okay, so ARIA can be used to describe standard web components or semantic elements like a heading or a button, but I won't be covering those in today's presentation. The ARIA authoring practices provide a guide for how to use attributes to effectively describe UI components so that users of assistive technologies in particular can fully understand and utilize an interface. Let's be clear though, this talk isn't focused on ARIA, but it is helpful to know where, when you're designing interfaces, that some components are supported, some components are not natively supported, whatever platform you're on. When that's true, it requires that additional thought be put into delivering an accessible experience. So most of, let's see here, really looks like pretty much all of the components that were referenced in the chat, whether it's carousels, maps and charts, a drag and drop interaction, a chatbot, these are all examples of essentially non-standard components. And so both the ARIA spec and the design patterns are there to be able to construct an experience that is then accessible for customers. And the ability to be able to look at a component or a user interaction and to be able to break it down further to sort of understand how it's built, what sort of interactions are actually at the basis of that component will help you in describing it in a way that will be accessible. Oops, just a moment here. Okay, so ultimately, what is the core problem that we're trying to solve? When we have user interface components which fall outside of the list of standard components that may not be natively supported by the accessibility APIs of the operating system. So when a user agent like a browser is exposing information to the accessibility APIs of the platform, it in the end will also render something called the accessibility tree. And the accessibility tree is essentially a secondary representation of the UI that you've designed and coded and presented. And the thing that we need to understand is that that representation really is what is then used to communicate to a user of assistive technology. A screen reader is a great example, just in that it's voicing literally what it can interpret from what's being delivered to it. So ultimately, we need to make sure that the components that we're building, especially custom components, are representing themselves in a way that can be understood and consumed by users of the accessibility tree. So ultimately, this problem is a technical way of saying that when you're building custom interfaces, you need to understand how to make that interface accessible. When you're first learning about accessibility, it can be difficult to envision how to do this. Or how to do this, or even how to spot interface elements that might be problematic. Though it seems like folks on the call so far have picked out some pretty good ones. Oops. Back up here. So in terms of a sort of broad solution, it is for custom components to be enriched with attributes in order to communicate semantic meaning and to deliver useful details to the accessibility APIs. Standardized UX patterns should be leveraged to deliver a familiar end user experience. So as a designer, it is particularly important to be able to spot these problematic interactions. By choosing to use them, you are potentially introducing additional work for developers and potentially adding friction for users. So in short, use of custom components and interactions should be done sparingly. If you can, fall back to standard components and interactions where possible. Now, of course, we want to create rich and immersive experiences, but we need to understand that we sort of, take on the responsibility of making sure that those custom interactions are ones that are clear for all users. So by gaining an understanding of how to analyze and break down the component parts of a user interface, you'll be more successful in delivering an accessible experience. So how do we go about doing this? So let me start by using an example. A carousel is a non-standard web component. When designing and implementing a carousel for use in a web browser, it's important to build the interaction in a way that can be understood by the user. What you're creating is an entirely custom and manufactured representation of a set of information. So really this concept of a carousel falls outside of what we know as standard UI components. And it starts really more as a visual concept. And so we basically then need to figure out how do we represent this visual concept in a way that can be consumed and expressed within the accessibility tree in a way that's useful. So the concept of a tab list, which contains a set of tabs, is a common UX design pattern used to convey the content represented by each slide in a carousel. The tab list pattern basically states that it's a list composed of a set of tabs, which are often displayed one at a time. Although in this example, we see 3 tabs or cards displayed at once. The way ARIA tab list pattern, which is defined in the authoring practices, has documented methods for navigating the tabs via keyboard and describes the roles, states, and properties which provide relevant information to the accessibility APIs and ultimately to the end user. The carousel may have additional UI controls, such as next and previous buttons. In the image displayed, for a little bit more detail, we see a carousel that is currently showing 3 of the slides or content cards in a row with a next button or icon button towards the right side of it to advance the carousel 3 more cards. Let's see, so in addition to the next and previous buttons, there may also be, for example, a set of dots that act both as a communication tool to show which tab is active, kind of like breadcrumbs. And at the same time, that may also act as a widget that can control navigating the carousel itself. So, deconstructing the interface. Deconstructing the interface. So when I'm first presented a user interface, I will inevitably ask myself certain questions. What is the designer's intent for the user? What do we want to enable the user to do? What is the action that needs to be taken? Often, we're designing a UI in order to gather information from the user. So, what kind of question is being asked of the user? Is it a yes or no question? Is a user presented with a list of choices and being asked to pick one? Questions are often implicit in many interactions. For example, do you want to activate or deactivate something? Cancel or confirm? Will you accept our terms and conditions? What date would you prefer for your departure? All of these are examples of questions which are often posed through the use of UI components. For example, a checkbox, a toggle, or a radio group, for example. To understand how I got to the way I conduct an analysis of an interface, it's helpful to know a bit about the concept of progressive enhancement. The way I break down an interface is influenced by my background in graphic design and as a front-end web developer. The concept of progressive enhancement, first coined by Steve Champion and Nick Fink at South by Southwest South by Southwest Interactive Conference in 2003, employs a strategy wherein a basic markup document is created, geared towards the lowest common denominator of browser software and functionality. And then the designer and developer adds functionality or enhancements to the presentation and behavior of the page. So said slightly differently, in the 2010 book, Designing with Progressive Enhancement, it states that progressive enhancement recommends that all web content and functionality be based on semantic HTML that's usable on any web-enabled device, and advanced CSS or JavaScript-based enhancements be layered unobtrusively on top. In short, progressive enhancement focuses on the content. What is the content supposed to be telling you? So in my head, I sort of I have this relationship between a designer's wireframe and that basic rendered HTML markup. Those two things essentially should be saying the same thing. The next step that a designer may take then is from that wireframe then to actually start to progressively enhance the boxes and labels and elements that are within that wireframe. So going from something, as we see on this slide, an image with three different controls. We see the first on the left, which is an input text field, which simply has a label that says enable, ? In the middle, we see a checkbox, also with the label enable. It basically takes that initial concept of an input field as the place to input an answer and creates a UI component that actually limits the kind of response that the user can make in terms of a checkbox. You're either selecting the checkbox or leaving it deselected. Then we take that same concept and progress it even further to what we would refer to as a toggle or a slider, which in and of itself is not a standard UI component in many instances, particularly as a standard web component. It doesn't exist. It is, in fact, a progressively enhanced, checkbox, essentially a two-state control. So when looking at a design, I'm thinking, how is it ultimately going to be rendered in the accessibility tree? Will the content speak for itself, or do I need to use tools like ARIA attributes to provide the clarity needed for someone accessing the content from what is rendered in the accessibility tree? Let's look at an example. So in the Mac operating system, the choice to enable or disable features that ask a yes or no question yes or no type of question are managed through the use of a checkbox. In this image, we see a screen grab of the VoiceOver preferences. Enabling VoiceOver is toggled by checking and unchecking a text box. In iOS, that same checkbox is managed using a toggle. So next we see a screen grab from the iOS mobile preferences. In both cases, making a change either to the checkbox or the toggle, the change is immediate. The question being asked of the user is, do you want VoiceOver to be functioning right now or not? Yes or no? Based on the current state, activating the component will immediately flip the state and reflect the change in the system. While progressive enhancement was originally designed with HTML in mind, it's a useful mental model to help deconstruct an interface in order to question the intent of the interface design and question whether or not it answers to the needs of the user. In the case of the toggle, it is a progressive enhancement of a checkbox. The checkbox is a progressive enhancement of simply asking a yes or no question, easily by providing an input text field. So, one of the things to me that sort of underlies this idea of progressive enhancement is to simplify. The key to understanding the patterns or pattern underpinning a component is to simplify it. In the current interaction, the most So is the current interaction you might be looking at the most simplistic way to approach the task, right? That toggle switch is a more sort of complicated way of asking a simple yes or no question, which you might be able to just simply type into an input field. So is the current interaction the most simplistic way to accomplish the task? If not, what is? It's useful to determine essentially what that most basic interaction is. Is it a yes or no question, right? And can the interaction be explained easily? If not, it's likely that your users won't understand either. So does the current UX design pattern create a more usable experience or more friction? In the case of a carousel, I would argue that it's more the latter. So what standard UX design pattern can be used to explain the component or the interaction? And in the case of the carousel, we saw earlier, I described earlier how the tab list UX design pattern is then sort of mapped on top of the carousel pattern so that it can be explained in a way that is consumable by everyone. So this is all where understanding the concept of progressive enhancement, I think, is useful. The same sort of principle in place to look at an interface and sort of break it down and understand what are the actual core components and user interactions underneath that, I think is really helpful to be able to ensure that you are communicating the right roles, states, properties, and usability of a component or an interaction. So one of the first things that, or one of the things that I often do with designers here at Adobe is to conduct a design review of ongoing work. I can imagine if you've been in my position before, I will get approached by designers at various stages of the design phase. They may have just heard about me and the role that I play at Adobe. And so they might come to me with wireframes, or they might come to me with an interface that's been fully designed and is already sitting on a staging server and is about 3 weeks away from going to production. And they want to know how, like what they can do to make those components accessible. And for anyone who's worked in that sort of environment before, you know, the latter is pretty late in the process. And so I don't have the benefit of being able to kind of understand all of the things that led up to those design choices and those interface components being chosen. And so it's useful to be able to take a sort of finished product like that and to be able to break it down to its sort of most basic elements, and then to build it back up again with the designer so that they understand how to best communicate the elements, properties and accessibility. So I'll do multiple passes of a UI design to evaluate the design from some different perspectives. Some of these are often included in some of the sort of accessibility checklists that you'll find out there. So I'll do visual checks, which include things like color contrast, use of color to identify states, errors or messages. I'll look at the content itself, right? Is the content that is either visibly being shown and or being communicated to the accessibility APIs creating enough meaning for the user? Is the content occurring in an order that is that makes sense, right? Is the content itself structured in a way that actually gives form to the document? You may have a visual representation of a web page where there are headings, or at least text that look like headings, but when you actually look under the covers at the HTML, they're just span tags that have been styled with CSS. And so in that case, the actual sort of structure of the page is not supporting the design itself. And then I'll look at additional things, of course, like reading level. Within sort of that content check, we'll look at content hierarchy as described by things like the page title, headings, and content regions, whether they're looking for the presence and clarity of labels, especially when you're talking about web applications. You'll often have iconography that's used in a variety of different ways. And so I will work with the designer to sort of work backwards and make sure that they are clear about how and what the label should, like what the label for that icon should be. What is this thing actually for? So that if we're still going to make the choice to not display the label visually, we are at least labeling it perhaps through an ARIA label attribute, so that information is being exposed to assistive technology users. And in general, I'll make other checks like looking at the design at different breakpoints, resizing text, or zooming the interface to make sure that the UI sort of holds up under those different conditions. And then finally, looking at navigation and the sequence of navigation. How is the user able to actually move focus through the content? Does it match up with the same sort of meaning and order and structure that we've looked for earlier when designing the document? And often when we have responsively designed sites and content is kind of moving around, that becomes especially important. So ultimately what I want to know is, do the sum of all these parts create a roadmap for an accessible user experience, like the beautiful new rope bridge image that I'm displaying on the left here? Or does it look more like the bridge on the right, which is old and missing planks to walk on and is otherwise falling apart? And so let's go ahead and begin to actually take a look at some of the individual components in particular that come up a lot when I'm talking with designers. There's often a lot of discussion about perhaps either how it's implemented, where it sits within the content flow, and some of the problems potentially that come up. So floating buttons. I think a lot of folks who are familiar with Google, they have their material design language, which has something called the floating action button, or the FAB for short. And long before the FAB, there were other floating buttons that have been a part of web and mobile applications for a number of years. One of the oldest examples is the back to top button, designed to scroll a long web page back to the top of the page. This button is usually positioned in the lower right side of the screen. While most browsers and operating systems support keys like page up and page down, home and end, in a mobile context, it's a nice alternative to having to swipe back up sort of endlessly. The downside is that depending on its size, it may be hard to activate. It may block content on an already small screen. In this example, and we're actually looking at a desktop view, but in this example, I'm showing a picture from the Adobe Help Center at helpx.adobe.com. In the bottom right corner, there is a floating button labeled that we looked at earlier on the Creative Cloud website. It is not visually labeled, but has an ARIA label associated with it that is it says "Contact Us." And when activated, it displays a customer service chat dialog. At its simplest, this is merely a button that opens a dialog. Simple, right? The nature of this particular dialog brings up another number of questions. Is it a non-modal dialog, meaning that a user can navigate out of and back into the dialog while it is displayed? Actually, let me bring up that dialog again here. So I've brought up again here the browser, my browser, which is showing the creativecloud.adobe.com website. It too has the floating button for Contact Us. And I'm going to go ahead and just, well, let's see, I'll click on it first to activate it. It will bring up a dialog that replaces the actual floating button and exposes a dialog with access to customer service. Because I'm logged in with my corporate account, it doesn't quite give me the same set of menus as if I were a typical consumer, which would sort of kick off a series of questions to figure out where to direct me to get customer service help. The challenge with, let's see here. So just to kind of back up a little bit here. So it is a non-modal dialog, meaning that a user can navigate out of and back into the dialog while it's displayed. This is because it's anticipated that a user may need to take an action within a parent page while continuing to interact with the customer service representative. So, the question becomes, one of the questions that I have is, where does this dialog occur in the document object model? So, is it common for dialogues and floating buttons to be appended, it is common rather, for dialogs and floating buttons to be appended to the end of a document, among other reasons, so that it can be added without causing changes in the focus order or other elements in the parent page. It also helps to establish a consistent place for users to find these components in the DOM. Yep, and thank you, Rakesh. We won't necessarily get to, I think, all of the components I was hoping to cover today, but I will be providing both a transcript and a copy of the deck following the presentation. So let me go ahead and continue. So in this example, the Contact Us button is located at the end of the DOM. And so the question becomes, how does a keyboard user easily get to the dialog? And that would apply for a screen reader user as well. Without a different method, they must either tab to the end of the document or shift tab from the beginning of the document to loop back around through the browser Chrome to the end of the document to reach the button. So, does this feature belong somewhere else? On the main adobe.com website, there happens to also be a button under the main navigation for the support menu to launch the Contact Us dialog. Does surfacing this button, though, as a floating element, increase or decrease its usability? The simplest approach could be a keyboard shortcut. But how do you surface that shortcut to the user? One approach would be to append it to the button's label, for example. So as I roll over or put focus on the button, I might see, let's say, the letter C in parentheses after Contact Us, or some other custom shortcut, so that I could easily bring the focus to either the button or the open dialog at the time. I'd like to take a look at one other component, I think, and I'm going to stop for just a moment to show another example of where we might have a floating button displayed, and it presents sort of certain challenges. In the first screenshot here, we see part of the Dropbox website interface, and I happen to be looking at a directory with the heading Accessibility Toolkit. It's a set of files that I distribute to help in the process of what we call blue lining. And when you look at the page, there's 4 rows in a table. When interacting with this page with the mouse, when I roll over one of the rows, I'll see a set of buttons exposed. But the question becomes then, how do we expose those same controls to someone who may be using a keyboard or a screen reader? And the Dropbox folks have come up with a novel solution, which is as soon as the tab key is detected to be in use, essentially, they automatically expose all of the buttons all at once that were otherwise hidden. Now, it's an interesting solution, although I think for the folks that can see the UI, it becomes a little problematic because those buttons then also obscure some of the content within the table itself. And so there's sort of these like competing priorities that they're trying to solve for, both to make these functions and features available to customers, but sort of sacrificing a certain level of clarity in the application. I'd also like to take just a moment then to talk a little bit about content cards. These end up in a lot of discussions that I have with designers, and some of the core thing, well, let me back up and say and give a little bit more information here. So ultimately, what is the content card? The material design language happens to have some pretty strong views on content cards. Material design being the design language that Google uses for its mobile apps and website application. So the first statement for the card component on the material design reference website says, content card or cards contain content and actions about a single subject. In the anatomy section of the same page, it says that the card container is the only required element in a card. All other elements shown here are optional. So a card is essentially a blob of virtually any kind of content with one or more actions. Purists would say that a card should have a single action, which directly correlates to the subject of the card. Cards can be so vague as to not have a definite, are so vague really as to not have a definition in the ARIA authoring practices. These authoring practices basically describe how to use ARIA attributes to describe components, right? But otherwise are not, which are otherwise not supported as native web components. Some native web components, such as buttons and links, are included, but the most interesting elements in the authoring practices are those like we were seeing before, the carousel, for example, a slider, a tree, or an accordion. So the image that we see on the screen right now is from the material design spec. It is showing some numbered pointers towards different elements of a content card. The top portion of the card includes the heading and the subheading. Below that, a placeholder for some type of media, often an image thumbnail, followed by a secondary description for the subject of the card, and then the lower portion, which actually is for what would be considered supplemental actions. So let's see here. So in this next image, it's showing a bit more of the breakdown between the two different regions of the card. So the thumbnail is a visual representation of the card's subject matter. Often the image is an abstracted representation that conveys a sense of the subject matter, creates a mood, or gives some sort of preview of the subject, but itself can't stand alone. Because of this, I typically advise developers to set a null value for the alternative text description or alt attribute. This essentially hides the image from the screen reader user, as the image is both repetitive and extraneous to the rest of the content of the card. The most important content in the card is the heading. The subheading and secondary text, while not necessary, often provide the needed context for the user to know if they want to interact with the content to which the card links. The secondary or supplemental section of the card typically contains additional actions related to the card subject and additional details which may be useful, but are not necessary to understand the card. So let's take a look at a working example here. And this example comes from actually the carousel that we saw on the Learn section of the Creative Cloud site. So the card's heading reads, "Get started with Photoshop," and the secondary text reads, "Learn the fundamentals of Photoshop so you can get started making your own great images." We don't see any secondary calls to action, which assumes that then the card would have a single action which could be taken by clicking anywhere on the card. But notice that the card contains a few other pieces of content. In the supplemental section, there are 3 icons that correspond to the text, to the right of each icon. The first icon is an image of a book adjoining the text 10 tutorials. The second icon is an image of a clock with the text 147 min, or 147 minutes. The third icon is an image of an eye with a numeric count representing the number of views that the tutorial has received. But there's one additional piece of content. There is sort of a tag that's laid on top of the image area of the card that reads, "For new users." And the question becomes, okay, what is this thing representing? I think it could be considered sort of a way to categorize the level, right? They might otherwise say "for beginners," or intermediate, advanced skill level. And its visual relationship on the card helps to give it some context, but the question is, in terms of, like, we would want to take a look at content order to actually break down when this thing would occur within the content, not just when it's displayed visually. And for the content in the supplemental section, where we have both the use of a visual and a value next to it, we want to make sure that we're actually surfacing. So as the first example, the icon with the book, and it says 10 tutorials, that there is some sort of representation of a label, whether it's number of tutorials, or for the time it being duration of the course, or the last one, number of views. And so we both want to surface that sort of hidden information, implied information by the visuals, as well as consider the content order. So, I would suggest that the heading and the subheading are always first, that supplemental information like the tag "for new users" might come next, although using CSS, it might be placed somewhere else visually within the card, and then followed by any of the other calls to action or supplemental information like I've described earlier. So I think what I'd like to do, just because we're coming up on time, I'd like to jump ahead just to talk a little bit about some of the techniques that we use to within Adobe to actually essentially break down or begin to document some of the things that we've been talking about today. So in terms of designing for accessibility, so at Adobe we've developed a process called blue lining, which includes a set of annotations that are used to mark up a design in order to essentially explain a lot of the things or document a lot of the things that we've talked about today, inspecting the content for structure, hierarchy, order, navigation, and sequence, right? All these topics. In particular, we take a look at tab order, other keyboarding that may be needed for the application or the website. We talked earlier about floating buttons and perhaps, for example, adding a keyboard shortcut. And so it would be a matter of deciding on and documenting that keyboard shortcut. as well as other information that we want to document and surface, information that may only be exposed to assistive technologies. I referred earlier to an ARIA label being used to add a label to the floating contact us button. And then potentially we might also want to document regions of the page, either potentially because they might need to be documented as ARIA landmarks, or more importantly, just to make sure that we sort of understand what are the different content regions that we're trying to represent. So in this particular interface, it's an example of how we might document regions on a page. So this interface is for a set of search results. In this case, it's sort of a sample wireframe depicting search results for searching for a restaurant. On the left, left rail, we have 3 accordions that act as filters that would filter the results by the neighborhood that you would find it in, the type of cuisine that you're looking for, and the price. In the main content area is a grid of the set of search results itself, with a set of filtering controls just above it, sorting by either rating or alphabetically. Below the actual results itself, we see a set of pagination controls. And this interface is marked up to define the different regions of the content on the page, and to potentially provide labels to those regions so that assistive technology users then would have a better sense of what interactive areas of content are on the page, and could actually then use those landmarks as ways to easily navigate around. Here we see this next example of documenting focus and keyboarding. So in this example, we see a depiction of, on adobe.com, we have a menu or a set of icons along the top right of the navigation, one of which exposes a popover to expose choices related to the user's account. And so we document with numbered icons what the tab order should be moving through that interface. Again, as I was saying earlier, often depending upon how code is written, the order in which it occurs in the DOM may actually not result in the kind of focus order that we would expect. And so as designers, we need to make sure that we're being very clear with developers about what our expectations are. For that same drop-down menu or popover menu for the account, we would also want to document what the labels are that we would expect to be exposed to customers. So the account icon in the main menu, or the top level menu, has no visual label, but we do still need to programmatically expose a label, as well as add additional properties, for example, such as an ARIA expanded or ARIA has pop-up attribute to the component, so that we're exposing the appropriate information to assistive technology users. And so this level of documentation is also a part of this process of looking at interface elements and breaking it down to its component parts, so that we're then able to fully express how this element is represented to the accessibility APIs, and then ultimately rendered within the accessibility tree. So I see that we're about at time, so I wanted to just go ahead and say thank you for joining me today. I will be sharing this deck back with Rakesh over the next few days. I need to get some of the transcript touched up and a few things done with the deck, but I'll certainly be happy to share it with everyone. Again, my name is Jack Nicolai. I can be reached at nicolai@adobe.com, or of course on LinkedIn. I've included at the end of the deck links to resources that I've mentioned in the talk itself, and otherwise some links to the way ARIA page references that I referred to earlier. So again, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Rakesh.
Thanks, Jack. That is a pretty much informative session, and I feel people would have benefited out of it. And as Jack mentioned, if you have any questions or any thoughts to Jack, feel free to message him, or even I can be a messenger if you wish to send something to me. Thank you. If there are any questions on the chat bot, we'll ensure that you will get them answered through the emails, because we have ran out of the time. Thank you. Thanks, Jack. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you for watching and being with us. Please like and share the video. Don't forget to click on the bell icon. And also, for more updates, subscribe the channel.